Much needed break over the holidays for Xavier basketball, but we are back. First game after the holidays coming up on New Year's Eve against Seton Hall. Welcome back to another edition of the Musketeer Madness podcast brought to you by the Field of 68 Podcast Network. As always, I'm Ben Haller. That's John Baldridge. Coming at you at a weird time. Talked about the break that just kind of, we're in the middle of that break right now. But I think the last time we filmed was after the Cincinnati game and right after the Zach Freemantle news that he was going to be out for an extended period of time. Since then, two very, very frustrating games that adds to that UC game to just a rough week of basketball. Three losses to top 25 teams, two of those coming on the road to Cincinnati. They had UConn and then one at home against a top 10 team in Marquette. All of those games, they had a 2 point lead with 4 minutes left against Cincinnati. They had a 1 point lead with 1:30 left against UConn and a 1 point lead with 1:30 left against Marquette. And they lost all three of those games. And you sandwich in between there the news of the injury for Zach Freeman. I'm still waiting to hear more about that. But overall, very frustrating week, John. Your first, just overall thoughts.
Yeah, well, first off, it's good to be back. Happy holidays, everybody out there. You as
Yeah,
well, Ben, and
appreciate it.
Merry Christmas. But for Xavier, they've had this 10-day break where they'll get back and play on New Year's Eve. But they were right there last week. They had UConn. They sent them to overtime. I thought Dante Maddox played incredible. They shot the ball at an incredible rate. And it didn't feel like a Xavier team that we've seen this year. It felt like a different Xavier team out there on the floor. And, overtime, I felt like it was more what I kind of expected, where UConn would use their size and use their strength and come out there and play really good basketball. And they did. And I felt like Xavier got tired, but also I felt like UConn was the better team in overtime. But overall, Xavier was strong in that game. And you lead into Saturday back at home. We were both there to see it, and Xavier just didn't really show up to start. They were down 15 late into that ball game, about 7 minutes left, but went on a late run to take a 1 point lead, 64-63, with about 2 minutes left. But just weren't able to close it out. And that's without Trey Vorey, who's been out the whole year, without Zach Freeman, as you mentioned, and also Trey Green. But it feels like finally, Davion McKnight in that second half against UConn stepped up, and some of these guys are just really stepping up with some tough losses, and now a chance to take on a Seton Hall team where you have to find a way to get a win. But Xavier last week overall pretty well, but then just disappointing to not win one of those two games.
Yeah, I mean, I'll bring up interesting. One of the first things that you said is that it didn't look like the Xavier team that we saw throughout the first, few weeks of the season, couple or month and a half of the season, I should say. I think for about 38 minutes, it didn't look like the Xavier at the
Sure.
start of the season. But the last 2 minutes is unfortunately, I think, what we've seen a lot, dating all the way back to the TCU game. I guess TCU game is where it starts. Take out the Michigan game, who's a top 25 team on the road or a neutral site. You didn't play very well. Whatever happens to that game, whatever. Just a bad matchup for Xavier. Since then, they had really good shots, and all four of their losses, TCU, Cincinnati, UConn, Marquette, all four of those losses, they were really close. Um, and they have been, there's no way to sugarcoat it. They've been very bad closing out games. That has been the number one problem. South Carolina State is right now, the only game that I can think of that was really close towards the end. I mean, South Carolina, they pulled away a little bit at the end, so it wasn't necessarily a close finish. But if your only close win is South Carolina State, it's usually not a very good thing. And in games where it's decided by like, five, 7 or less points, Xavier's 1-4 at this point in the
Yeah.
year. And there's been one glaring issue closing out games. It's been the turnovers. Two big turnovers late against Cincinnati, or go back all the way back to TCU. Two big turnovers late against TCU. Two big turnovers late against Cincinnati, where Davion McKnight just lost the ball. Zach Freeman threw it out of bounds. Two big turnovers late against UConn. And then that happens both in the end of regulation and at the end of overtime. And the two big turnovers might have been the most frustrating part against Marquette, the most recent game on Saturday. One of them where Dalen Swain just didn't see a defender behind him, tried to do too much. And then one where Jerome Hunter got the ball on the free throw line and tried to go behind the back with three defenders around him. Um, Obviously, very frustrating. The most frustrating part about it, though, to me, is it's different guys who are victims of these situations. So it's not like you can point at one guy and be like, okay, this guy doesn't perform well in late game situations. I mean, out of all those situations, I just named a Zach Freemantle turnover, a Davion McKnight turnover, a Dalen Swain turnover, a Hunter turnover, and I'm sure there's a Marcus Foster or a Dante Maddox turnover that I'm not thinking about in those situations. Especially Davion McKnight, one of the best in the country in assisted turnover ratio a season ago. It is a plague right now with this team in those late game situations. And my biggest worry to this point is that moving forward, when they're playing lesser opponents and they have a better chance to win against a team that's maybe worse than UConn or Marquette, it still gets mental about closing out games, and that's the biggest thing that worries me.
Yeah, and I think the disappointing thing too is that you're having guys, it's not just one guy who's been your, leader or your focal point this year. I mean, we talk about Marcus Foster having a good game last time out.
Yeah.
It's been, Dante Maddox we talked about. Jerome Hunter had a really good game against Marquette. So it's been different guys to step up and make buckets and make points. But late in those games against, as you mentioned, TCU or Michigan or Marquette or UConn, it's been the disappointment, the unexecution to close out ball games. And that's been the story here of late. And when you think about, trying to put something together towards the future and we got more games to play, it comes down to those turnovers you talked about. And that's just been a crucial loss for Xavier. And you can blame it on and the fouls, and you can blame it on possibly a trip, and we can talk about that in a little bit on at the end of the game against Marquette on Saturday. And a lot of fans, and I agree, I believe there was a trip, there was a foul there, and I give all credit to Sean Miller leaving the floor and not having an edge about it. Went
Yeah.
straight to the press room, had his conference, and got out of there. But that's a tough one to get over. But Xavier has been in all these games, and you can't blame it on the refs. You got to go out there and execute, and they just haven't been able to.
I mean, yeah, there's really hasn't been much debate on Twitter if it was a trip or not. Truly, if anyone who's seen the replay, a pretty bad no call,
Yeah.
especially for Brian O'Connell, who was right in front of it, who Xavier fans have a history with, going all the way back to the Big East tournament in 2019. Um, but yeah, I credit Sean Miller for just leaving the floor after that. Also credit Ryan Conwell, didn't make a huge deal after that, after he was the one that got tripped and was laying on the floor. Um, but man, Sean Miller is not happy. I actually wasn't at the Marquette presser, but you said you showed up late because Sean Miller, he went straight from the game into the presser. No radio show. He sent Dante Jackson to go do his radio show. He didn't address the team first. He went straight to the presser, which is very rare for anyone who's
Yeah.
not around, college basketball media that much. And Sean Miller pressers are usually about what, 10 to 12 minutes, you'd say, with like the opening statement, just the way Sean Miller is, a very vocal guy. This one
Well,
was,
there's a certain format. They always have the players will go first. They'll
yeah.
answer questions and they'll go about 5, 10 minutes. He'll come out there, do
Then
his
the
opening
opposing coach a
statement,
lot
and
of
then it's
time.
5 or 6 minutes of questions and he's gone. It was not like that at all
Yeah,
against Marquette.
barely 3 minutes. He was
Yeah.
taking questions. Not all the media was even in the room yet. You were one of them who just wasn't in the room yet because the home coach is usually not there that early. But he wanted to get it out of the way. And I'm sure part of it too is he didn't even know how to address the team after that. You can sense the frustration for him. And the one thing that he kept harping on in those 3 minutes of that presser was just how much his team needed a break. And I don't, that might be almost a crutch of him because he doesn't even know what to say after this team just continues to blow games in late game situations with less than 2 minutes left, turning the ball over. Um, but whatever he said to his game post game, I'm sure wasn't the most positive thing in the world. You could dwell on the past all you want. There's only a number of ways you could talk about how frustrating this last week was with those three losses and the news to Fremantle. Yeah, at some point, you have to do some sort of damage control and start to look to the future and say, all right, these things have happened. Still have 18 games left to play. What needs to be done to get this team back on track? Where they sit right now, they're 57 in Ken Palm and I believe 64 in the net, I want to say, when we're recording this at least. Big part of what's helped them in the net is TCU has played well over the last couple of weeks, and they've actually moved up to a quad one loss. So Xavier's resume right now looks like this, sitting at 64 on the net. They are 0-5 against quad one opponents, but that is all five losses they have. They're 1-0 against quad two opponents, 1-0 against quad three opponents, and then 6-0 against quad four opponents. So I don't think there's anything surprising about the net ranking right there, and the resume is really a team that you just haven't learned much about yet. They do not have a great win. They do not have a bad loss. Um, but I mean, you're playing the Big East. You need to stack a few really good wins to make the tournament, and they've already had five opportunities for those in the uh, quad one section, and they have not been able to take advantage of any of them. They do have eight coming up, eight quad one games coming up, six quad two games, one quad three, or sorry, three quad three, one quad four. Before talking about any of those quad one, quad two games, the one quad four game remaining is the next one, and it is a must win. Home against Seton Hall on New Year's Eve. It's like a 2 o'clock game. A quad four loss virtually ends your season, especially at this point of the year when you don't have any quad one wins. But you get that Seton Hall win, and you win your other quad three game, which I believe is, or your other quad three games, which I believe is like at Seton Hall, and then home against like Georgetown and DePaul maybe. Um, Other than that, I think you got to win four quad one games, and you can't lose more than one or two quad two games. This is what you and I talked about before coming on the podcast. All those things are doable, especially the way they have played
Yeah.
the last week against UConn and Marquette and shown they belong. The issue is just you can't slip up much. There's not much room for error, having to do all of those things. So I don't know. I don't know how likely you see this team being a tournament team. It is still really early to talk about that, but if you really want to look for some numbers, that's what I got.
Yeah, I want to put them as a tournament team right now. They can still get there, but they got to stack. They got to start stacking wins together. At some point, you got to start putting wins together, and this is a great chance against, as you just mentioned, teams that you should beat. Seton Hall, they should be heavily favored. Georgetown, it's a road game. They should go out there and win next Friday. St. John's will be tough with Tino back in there, but they seem like they've always played St. John's pretty well since joining the Big East. And DePaul will be tough on the road, and then Villanova the next five. But those are all games, Ben, you have to take, or you got to at least win 4 or 5 of those. And you got to find a way to start stacking these wins together because right now, if you continue to lose, you're sitting at 8-5 on the year. The way they've been losing games of late, we mentioned just being late in these games and not being able to close. You got to find a way to start winning and then start winning by a key factor where it's not so close. And hopefully you can do that against a Seton Hall team where you should be favored by, I would say, 10 points or so.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say that number's about fair. The other issue is having to rely on some of these quad one wins. These are a lot of fringe quad one games, fringe quad games. And what that means is so the criteria for a quad one game, top 30 at home, top 75 on the road in terms of net. Here are a list of games that are currently quad one for Xavier, but obviously it changes, with when the other team's net ranking changes. So TCU sits at 74 in the net. So they are quad one by just 2 spots after getting picking up that loss on the road. St. John's is 28. So that home quad one game against St. John's is just hanging on by 3 spots. Um, some others, Creighton is 72 right now in the net. So if they drop, 4 more spots, they move to quad two on the road and quad three at home. There's a lot of teams like that that are around that 75 spot, including Providence, who is right on 75 at the dot. So it's just the Butler's at 70 as well. So it's just the odds say that one of those teams will probably drop. That's where this gets dangerous too, is you say, all right, maybe there are four very winnable quad one games. You go to Butler, you go to Villanova, who I don't know if I trust, you go to Providence, tough place to play, but I still don't think Providence is a very good basketball team. And you start to say those are winnable games, but you pick up four of those and you feel confident about that. The next day, Providence and Villanova drop below 75, and those aren't quad one games anymore. So that's why I think like four, if we're at the end of the season and they have four, I'd like to think that comfortably puts them in maybe at about an 8 or 9 seed. but I'd like to see 5 or 6 to be safe, just in case one or two of those drop. Good news is I do see a lot of those as winnable. Providence I mentioned, I don't think is a very good basketball team. Butler's in that same boat. Both of those places are tough to win though, and that's why it's so tough when you get to these 75 spot in quad one. But it can go the other way too. Georgetown sitting at 78, so they've looked pretty good recently. If they put a few more wins together, they could jump into a top 75 spot. The point is it moves so much up and down.
Yeah.
And it's hard to look at that right now when you have 2 months left in the season. And I think what you said is perfectly. Just start stacking wins. You can sit here and talk about the quads all you want. For me, getting safely into the tournament with this schedule, I think is a 21-10 regular season. Sitting at 13-8 right now. That's finishing 13-5. Um, sorry, 8-5 right now. I don't 8-5 to the first 13.
Yeah.
And then you go 13-5, I think, is what puts you safely into the tournament. It's doable, but a lot of things need to happen. And maybe Fremantle comes back, but I fear that teams might start to figure out what Xavier's doing with Hunter at the five. Had some moments where Swain was at the five. It's just a different kind of basketball, and teams are going to start to have more film on it.
Yeah, I mean, they got to start stacking wins. And, you look at who they've lost to this year, but you also think about who they've beat. And they've only beaten two Power Five teams in the country, South Carolina. And you go all the way back, it seems like forever ago now in November when you beat Wake Forest.
Yeah.
So, you got to put wins together. You take on a very tough Big East conference, and it doesn't matter who you go to. I mean, you got to play each team two times, which you don't do in most conferences. You take on Georgetown, you're talking about coaches who have a lot of experience, and Ed Cooley. We just mentioned Rick Pitino with St. John's 3 games from now. So there's a lot of good coaches. There's a lot of good players in the Big East, but it seems like they've been done a good job this year against some of those really good players like Cam Jones on Saturday, kind of keeping these guys in check. But you got to find a way, have some separation in these games, but also when it comes to those close late game stretches, to find a way to win, and they just haven't been able to do that of late.
Yeah. The other interesting part about the upcoming schedule is the schedule itself, just in terms of when these games happen. Obviously, that was a really, really tough 3 game stretch where you go to Cincinnati, you go to UConn, and then you play Marquette at home. 3 top 25 teams, and a home game. The only home game is against a team that is top 10 in the country. You get some very winnable but could be tough games coming up. You mentioned all of them. Seton Hall at home, need to win that one. But then you go to Georgetown, St. John's at home, go to DePaul, Villanova at home. After that, you once again have another really tough stretch where their next 7 games after that, 6 of them are quad one games. That's Marquette on the road in Milwaukee, St. John's on the road in New York, UConn at home, Creighton on the road in Omaha, Georgetown at home, Villanova on the road in Philadelphia, and then Providence on the road in Providence. Um, I just sense that this 3 game stretch was really tough on them and it beat them down a little bit and really hurt their confidence. That's something that just can't happen in another stretch like that.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this team where we are now compared to where we were last year, and you hate to put, reference to a team last year, but Xavier's have a losing record at this point last year.
Mm.
So, this is a lot better team than they have last year. The problem has been, and we've hit on it since the beginning of the season, when you lose Trey Vorey, then you lose Fremantle, then you lose Green, and you're still looking for that vocal captain this year. And finally, it looks like Davion McKnight's coming around. Jerome Hunter's been able to score the basketball of late, and they're having different guys execute game in and game out. The question has been, can they get all these guys to work together? And if they can do that, this can be a tournament team. This can be a team to stack those wins together and to be able to have a late run into March. But right now, where you lost, to UConn and Marquette, TCU, and some of these really close losses, you got to find a way to finish those games, and you got to find a way to do that here quickly, starting against Seton Hall on New Year's Eve.
Well, I think too is you have to. I know no one likes to take moral victories, but you have to take some just in the way that these games have happened. Obviously, not having Fremantle against UConn and Marquette. Who knows if they'll have them at any point in this season? But Conwell did not shoot well, did not play well at all
Yeah.
against Marquette, and they still almost won that game. You look at that and you say that you should be able to beat some of the lower teams of the Big East. Once again, the problem is just the confidence in how they can finish the games. I've said it, and I've not shied away from saying this on the podcast. I really do feel like this team goes as Davion McKnight goes. And I have not loved the way he's played, the first let's say that like second month of the season. He started the first few games off really well, then went through a rough stretch for about a month. But recently, he started to play a lot better. He had a really good game against Marquette with 14 and UConn with 18. That's the Davion McKnight they need. And even though those are games they're losing, I think you would say that even the UConn and Marquette games are two of the better games they've played all season long. And I think a big part of that is because of the way Davion McKnight's played. The you can go to the specifics of not having Fremantle on the floor right now. One of the biggest things that I do like about it is the lane is so wide open. Xavier's running five out almost exclusively. Especially when Jerome Hunter's on the floor. It's a little different when John Hughley's on the floor, but if it's Hunter or Fletcher at the five, so much room for guys like McKnight and Swain and Foster to get to the basket. But once again, those are some of the things that maybe teams start to figure out and start to game plan for. Um, Still a very talented team and still a very well coached team, and those are the things that you just have to trust moving forward.
Yeah, I think when you look at this team, and I went to Shaka Smart's press conference after the win on Saturday, and he mentioned Ryan Conwell, how they kind of kept him in check. Only had 7 points, only made one three, was 0 for 7 to start from three in that game, and he was out there about an hour before the game and saw Conwell shoot about 33s and went about, I think he said 29 for 30 from the 3-point arc, and he's an excellent shooter, but they really kept him in check. I feel like they got out to him quick and didn't allow a lot of open contested. Everything was contested. A lot of threes that Conwell had looks, but they weren't great looks. And he finally got a couple late, made one three, finished with 7 points. But just it wasn't promising from him, and he's got to be able to get to that next level that Xavier expects him to be at this year, and he just hasn't been there of late. And then, he had a chance later in the game. As Shaka said, that call, it depends on what your fandom is. If you're a Xavier fan, of course, you think it's a trip, and I believe it was a trip. But if you're a fan of Marquette, you see it the opposite way, and that's what he, of course, said in his press conference. But, Xavier's got to be able to find one guy to really go to. And it seems like it's been a different guy each game, which is great. But if they can put it all together as one and find a whole team to build around, it will bring a lot more success here as we get set for more conference games.
Well, and I think that Fremantle was that guy. And he was starting to develop into that guy. Every
Yeah.
game he's played this year, he scored in double figures. He really was starting to bring that consistency to this team to where it's like the timing is just so unfortunate of this team finally starting to play better, but he's not on the floor. So all you can do right now, if you're a Xavier fan, is just pray and hope that Fremantle comes back soon. Because without him, it's tough. It's just tough to evaluate right now with the injury and with the losses, but the way they played against UConn and Marquette, it's really hard, and I don't think anyone knows what to expect from these last 18 games of the season. Um, it can go a lot of different ways. I'll say that. It really can. I wouldn't be surprised by really any outcome at this point. Final thoughts about that, John, before we make our Seton Hall score predictions.
Yeah, I mean, losing Fremantle was, crucial, but you also lose Trey Vorey, who is your best rebounder, and you lose Green, who might, sit out for what his injury is and see how that plays. But, you're losing key pieces, and you went from a loaded, backcourt, loaded front court, having a lot of depth on this team to just not having a whole lot. And it feels like Xavier is having to build what they have and trying to find those pieces to all work together. And it's been a struggle late in games, but if they can be able to execute a little better through those 18 games they got left, there is a lot of promise for this team.
All right, John. Let's get to some score predictions. Seton Hall, no way to sugarcoat this. They have been terrible this year. Like I said, they're a quad four game for Xavier right now. They're sitting at 176 in the net. Um, th th I haven't watched them a ton. It seems like on Twitter that they've been really upset with Dylan Adewusu, one of their guards that's been there for a little bit. Isaiah Coleman, I believe, is their leading scorer, averaging about 14 a game. They just don't have much going for them. Only two players averaging double figures. It's Coleman with um, 14, and then they have Chauncey Jenkins with I think 11 a game.
Yeah.
So they've struggled at every point this year. They've actually had a pretty good defense, um, but overall they are no threat to score. So I'll get your score prediction first.
Sure, Xavier needs to win this one. They've been able to score the basketball at a high clip this year. I do think they are able to put a lot of points on the board and they will come home with a victory. I'll give it in like an 83-73 win. And I think Seton Hall has the talent, has, the size and has the scoring potential to win this game. Xavier's got to go out to shoot the basketball well, as they've been able to do recently, but they can't find themselves behind by 15 again or 10 at some stretch and have to be able to pull their way back into it. They won't be able to do that every single game, but it feels like this is a game Xavier must have, got to start stacking wins together, and I think they get it done at home on New Year's Eve.
Yeah, it's a must-have. I think too that the frustration. I think they're going to come out with a bit of fire. I think this break's going to help them. A lot of times, a big break like this hurts teams. I think in Xavier's case, it'll help them. I like a big win for Xavier here. I think they win by 18 points. I'm gonna go 86. I'll say 86 to 86 to 68, I believe would be a 16-point win there. Trying to do the math right. I
Yeah.
think that's what it is. So 18-point win for Xavier. Um, but yeah, it's hard to find more ways to say that it's a must win. The last quad four game for Xavier, so the last, catastrophic possible loss. But 2 o'clock at the Cintas Center coming up on Tuesday. But for John Baldridge and I, once again, thanks for listening to a holidays edition of Musketeer Madness podcast. Have a